Well, good afternoon.
This could be our.
I'm Charles Overby, chairman of the Overby Center for Southern Journalism and Politics, and it's my distinct honor to welcome you all here today. This is a big weekend for a lot of reasons, and we're glad to start it off, to kick it off. We're particularly pleased that Mississippi Today would want to do one of their main programs of the year right here at the Overby Center. We have several board members from Mississippi Today here, but we're especially honored to have the chairman of Mississippi Today, Donna Barksdale. Donna, would you stand and wave to everybody? Donna, that's more applause than most of the speakers get here. So that's pretty good.
And that will hold true.
Present company accepted. This program is co-sponsored by the Overby Center and by the Meek School of Journalism. And the dean of the Meek School of Journalism is here with us, Dr. Will Norton. Welcome, Will. And Ed Meek is around here somewhere. I don't know whether he's actually sat down. The school is named after Ed Meek. Ed and Becky have been very generous to this school, and Ed, we appreciate you so much, Ed and Becky. Now, we thought it would be fun to get together, get the thinking people of Mississippi, and they're all assembled right here in this one room.
He can say that.
Yeah.
Jim, I said that as the Overby Center chairman, not as a member of the Mississippi Today board, but because he's out raising money for Mississippi Today. But I thought it would be fun to have thinking people come and engage in a high-level conversation about lights, electricity, about presidential politics, Trump, and the press. And you'd think, okay, well, what a fertile subject. But I had no idea that every day for the last 110 days, the fertility would mount. And I can't think of, if I were marooned on an island and Andrea wasn't available to me, these are the two people I'd want to be with because they're so interesting to talk to. And we're going to have that opportunity today. Jon Meacham, y'all see him on the air. You know who he is. He has the good judgment to live in Nashville and then go everywhere else.
That's right.
And he is, I said it in one of my quotes for a story, he's a one-man conglomerate, a media conglomerate. He's a writer, author, speaker, TV commentator, book publisher, executive, so many other things. And he does it all and makes it look so effortless. And he's a hometown hero in Nashville, but he's known, of course, all over the country. Andy Lack's not on the air. He could be if he wanted to, because he runs the place at NBC. And he knows everybody, and he knows so many things about so many subjects. He's fun to talk to. He's fun to be around. And happily for Mississippi, he has good genes. His great-grandfather was the mayor of Greenville. And Andy is interested and continues to be interested in his roots. And he comes back to Mississippi often. He's a great friend of Ole Miss. And he and Curtis Wilkie, Curtis is a senior fellow here at the Overby Center. When they get together and start swapping stories, I just want to sit there and not let it end. And so today we're going to have Andy Lack and Jon Meacham swap stories with one another and perhaps provide a little insight into presidents, politics, and Trump. So without further ado, I turn it over to Andy Lack.
Hey, how's it going?
Very quiet news day.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is someone taping this?
How you been?
I know it's Mississippi. Come on, y'all.
Are we off the record?
Always, always. I remember Ann Richards once came to a meeting at Newsweek, and there were about 10 of us around the table, and we said, Governor, how would you like to do this, on the record or off the record? And she looked around and said, do you boys want to learn shit or not? We said, well, yes, ma'am, we do. She said, well, then it better be off the record.
Okay. Well, speaking of shit. So you all know that Jon is the Pulitzer Prize-winning author and presidential historian. His sweet spot among many of the presidents, arguably, is Andrew Jackson. Some of you are familiar with Andrew Jackson? You're familiar with the relationship between Jackson and Trump, perhaps?
Yeah. Very close.
Well, I just wanted to get to it with you.
Okay.
How did Trump scoop you?
I know.
I mean, wait, if I've understood this correctly, how did you miss
I know.
that Jackson, had he come a little bit later, could have stopped the Civil War?
Even in book form, it is just the first rough draft of history. Which reminds me, one more profane story about powerful women. When I was I'd been at Newsweek for about 5 months, and there's an old section of the magazine called Periscope, which is at the front of the magazine. And the old joke was your reporters got $50 for Periscope items, 100 if they were true. And we'd published something about a senator, I can't remember who, and that Monday morning, the magazine used to come out on Monday mornings, the senator had called Mrs. Graham, who owned the magazine at that time, and had ruined her breakfast. And so in the manner of all great leaders, she decided to ruin everyone else's. And so she called my good friend, then the Washington bureau chief, Evan Thomas, and I happened to be in Evan's office, and I could hear her voice on the phone. And she was giving him hell, like, why, how could you do this? And Evan said, quoting her husband, the late Phil Graham, well, you know, ma'am, journalism is just supposed to be the first rough draft of history. To which she said through the phone, but does it have to be so fucking rough? So, now.
We've got an F-bomb here.
Yeah, there we go. So, Jackson at Ford's Theater was something I missed in the book, but presidents see as they wish to be seen.
Yeah.
And they live in a house of history. They're surrounded by two kinds of images. The oil portraits, obviously, but they're also, for those of you who've been in the West Wing or might have had occasion, Air Force One, Marine One, Camp David, all these places, they actually, in the workspaces of the White House, of the executive branch, are pictures of themselves, right? There are photographs of them at different events. There are photographs of the vice president, the families. And so they live in a reinforcing, solipsistic atmosphere. And so we wonder why they're all crazy, And with Trump, he needs some historical analogs. I spent an hour and a half with him in May of last year talking about just this. What are you reading? What are you thinking about historically as you prepare for this? It was a brief conversation. It was like interviewing the Admiral in Mary Poppins. He was firing off cannons. He had funny hats.
Do any of the Trump voters want to stand up and be recognized?
No. This is not. No. Look, what I admired about Trump in this is I sat down, and Andy, who's one of my bosses, will appreciate this. So I walk in the room, and he says, "It's an honor. It's an honor to be interviewed by you. I've never read any of your books, but you're great on TV." and I really I appreciated the candor, because what Secretary Clinton would have said is, "Oh, I read your book on X and it changed my view of Y." And she would have been lying, and I would know she was lying, and we would both know each other were lying, and we would be participating in this kind of establishmentarian fiction. And Trump was being honest. He hadn't read the books, but he is, as you know, a cable news addict, literally. And so he did not mention Jackson in that whole occasion. Now, forgive the solipsism of this, but a quick Google search about the guy coming to interview you might get you to Jackson with me. It just might. But it didn't come up at all. It didn't come up until right after the election. Steve Bannon argued that Trump was a neo-Jacksonian and sort of talked to him about this. And then we have in the room, actually, one of the two people who was with the president at the Hermitage, the regent of the Hermitage, Frances Bradley, who was there. So she's witnessed this. It's like being the witness at a car wreck to some extent. But and he like all of them. That's Trump. He didn't like that last joke. He needs some reference points. And so they had the portrait, the Ralph Earl portrait. Ralph Earl lived in the White House with Jackson. Jackson understood modern communications. He kept a portrait painter in the White House.
When was the last time that portrait was hung in the Oval Office after Jackson left?
A lot of the guys have had it. FDR had it. Truman had it. 41 had it. And Trump thought it was Michael, but that's okay. So he just he likes this mythology, and he's obsessed with. These are what I think happened is sort of the nitrogen and the glycerin intervened when he made this comment about Jackson and the Civil War. He said to me in that interview last year that he thought the Civil War could have been averted, that there was a deal to have been struck. And we ended up, when I mentioned the Crittenden Compromise, things went south really fast. And he told me that he had once canceled a golf match to binge watch Ken Burns' Civil War. It's so improbable, I think it's probably true. So I think he has this idea that he could have stopped the Civil War, and a smart deal maker could have, plus Jackson. I think those two pinballs just hit in his head, and he made that point.
Well, actually, coincidentally, I met with Trump for an hour and a half last May.
Maybe you're the one. Did you mention Jackson?
I thought I was the only one. Did you meet him at the Trump Tower?
I did. There'll be a tape later, probably. He signed hats for me. It was great.
Yeah, I got two.
I got a camo one, so he couldn't sign it, but he didn't understand that.
I got a signed bumper sticker also for my son.
Did you? Mm-hmm. Well, it'll be worth something pretty soon.
My hour. my hour and a half with him was slightly different. He spent the first half hour talking about another politician and actor who was replacing him on The Apprentice, Arnold Schwarzenegger. We talked about the possibility that Arnold's ratings might be worse than his for about 45 minutes. And he actually knew every detail there was to know about the ratings. And he knew, he doesn't hate the media at all, and he doesn't hate the news world at all, fake news notwithstanding. He actually loves it.
Yeah.
He can't get enough of it. And if you read Time magazine this week, I think, the After Hours issue, you see it. He's got a DVR. He is just a creature of TV. And he watches Jon Meacham on Morning Joe. He watches Morning Joe on Morning Joe. He not so much this last 2 months, but that said, and then he's very transactional about, well, what do you want from me? What are we going to do? We'll do the Today Show. Should we do it in Rockefeller Center? And I'm thinking we could do that. Will there be helicopters up from WNBC, the local station? He's picturing the entire production. Yeah. And it goes very, very easily. And pictures, I'm going to walk down Fifth Avenue. I'm going to make an entrance into Rock Center. How many people do you think you're going to have in there, Andy? And of course, I'm multiplying in my head times 10, whatever the real number might be. Right. So 100,000. Could be 100,000.
Easily.
I think 100,000 would work. I think we could do that. Easily. I think Rockefeller Center could get 10,000, but in any case, he sees all of us that way, and in the White House as well. And he is, interestingly, when you think of the campaign, he was not only accessible. We get a lot of criticism in the media, or I did, along with some of the other channels, that you elected Trump because you never stopped covering his rallies, never stopped putting him on TV. The reality was that we actually didn't do that as much as you would have thought. But the point was he was so accessible, and he wanted to tell his story, and Hillary did not. She was very difficult, very challenging to get her to do anything.
Well, she would not. I mean, one of the reasons that Trump, it was for Time magazine, one of that interview that I did with him was the cover of Time the week of the Republican convention, and there was no corresponding Democratic one because she wouldn't talk to me about how she was thinking about preparing for president. If you're Hillary Clinton, that's the hanging curveball of all hanging curveballs. But it was not a controllable element. They didn't want to do it.
I think the biggest story that we missed, certainly NBC missed, I was talking about this with Chuck Todd actually the other day, we underestimated the dislike of Hillary in the country. The skepticism was so deep. And I think particularly if you were in the bubble in New York or in Hollywood, you just had no idea. And we didn't cover that well. I was exposed to it with her. We did an event, maybe some of you saw it. It was called the Commander-in-Chief Forum. And it was right after the conventions. And we got killed for it. Matt Lauer got, oh my gosh, social media went after him. Why? Because he asked Hillary Clinton 3 questions about her damn email. And in New York, that was seen as a felony at that point in the campaign. Now, he also, it was combined with, he hadn't, Trump mentioned the 2002 Howard Stern interview where he supported Iraq, and then he forgot that he supported it 14 years later. Arguably, the statute of limitations had run out. Arguably, his memory might have failed over those times. But the point was, he wasn't a politician. He'd answered this a bunch of times, and Matt consciously made the decision on live television not to go there and fall down that rabbit hole, and actually ask him about Russia and Putin. We scored, for the first time, some big, interesting details on Putin. Lost in the fact that in the New York Times, we had let Trump off the hook in that one moment, and we had gone after Hillary in a way that was, this was the big phrase in the campaign, there was like a moral equivalency of how could you equate questioning her in the same way that you would question him. So that was a conundrum. But the more you spend time with Trump and the more you spent time with Hillary, you saw the challenge he had with the electorate, particularly when you got out of the bubble of Manhattan. But you all saw it in Mississippi. I mean, I didn't see a lot of lawn signs here for Hillary. But
if you did, they were in this county.
Yeah.
So, small anecdote, but as Aristotle taught us, the particular illuminates the universal. When I went to that conversation in May of last year, walked in, I was early, and so I went to the Starbucks in the lobby of Trump Tower, got my coffee, went back down, and was standing in front of those elevators that became so iconic during the transition. And a family, clearly on vacation, I don't know if they were Southern or Midwestern, but they were not New Yorkers, came in through the revolving door. It was a mother and a father and a kid, probably 10 years old, little boy. And I was just standing there eavesdropping. And the little boy said, in a voice tinged with awe, "Do you think he uses that door that we just came through?" As if he were talking about Bruce Wayne or Batman. It was a superhero to him. This was a heroic figure. And the father said, "Oh no, I bet he has a secret entrance." And the boy went crazy at that. And it was a moment, a small moment, but it should have triggered something more profound in me, that while in that zip code, which is where Andy lives and works and where I have lived and worked for a long time, our tribal view, the view of the people who didn't like the email questions and attacked Matt, was totally on a different plane than the view of those folks who just wanted to walk into Trump Tower where he walked. Mm-hmm. And that drama, that idea that this was a heroic figure who was going to slay the dragon of the established order, was an immensely powerful drama. The other 2 reasons I think he won, and the reason that even now, even today, where the President of the United States, we should note this for the record, has not denied that he is audio taping conversations in the White House. His spokesman and he have now had an occasion to say they are not doing it, and they have not done it. The reason he is the president is, and the reason that a lot of people are not going to change their views of him, I'd say there's a core like Nixon of 35 to 38%. Nixon was still at 38% in August 1974. People forget that.
Yeah.
Is because, and also about the dislike of Hillary, there were 9 presidential tickets between 1980 and 2016. 7 of them had a Bush or a Clinton. 7 of them. The other key number is $130,000. $130,000 is the household income for a family of 4 that the Commerce Department estimates is required to lead a classic post-World War II middle-class life. Household income in the United States of America today for a family of 4 is $57,500. So in that missing $72,500, plus that drama, you have frustration that those 9 tickets didn't move that number more dramatically. Last number is 17%. 17% is the number, according to Gallup, of Americans who trust Washington to do the right thing some or most of the time. That's down from 77% in 1965. So in 50 years, we've gone from more than 3 out of 4 Americans trusting Washington to fewer than 1 in 5. And those numbers have not moved. And so you have, and I use the word advisedly, you have a tribal sensibility now of people who believe that this man was the answer to these problems, or at least the only answer at hand.
Yes, yes, and the latter particularly true. The calculus around what really happened in these states in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. The company NBC is owned by, many of you may know, Comcast, which is in Philadelphia. I can tell you in the suburbs of Philadelphia, they did not believe that election night that the numbers that Obama had posted in those areas where Hillary was winning, but nothing along the lines that Obama had seen. Yeah. She was really crashing with the African American vote in those sections. They had no idea. Local stations, zero idea. I mean, if we failed in terms of the press corps covering his candidacy, it was that we didn't cover the people who voted for him in the ways that would have been more illuminating, as much as we should have. We did. We got out there. I mean,
I love self-flagellation, particularly with Andy. But I don't think this is a case for it. I really don't.
No, you're right. I didn't mean to get that far out.
There's nobody in America, at least who's even remotely swayable, who didn't know what we were getting with the 45th president. The point is, I think, that wages have not gone up in 35 years. Globalization and its discontents are the defining issue of our time in the way that race was in the 1960s, in the way basic economic security was in the 1930s, the way the shift from farming to manufacturing was in the 1890s. And they just, to some extent, I think, the country looked at Washington and said, if you're going to act like a reality TV show, we're going to send you a reality TV show.
You had a good line yesterday. I'm going to not prod you and pretend I don't know it, but I'm going to steal it from you.
Okay.
And it's consistent with what you just said. We were talking about what is Trump about. And Jon said, he is not about the art of the deal. He is about the art of the headline. Right. And for us in journalism, that resonates. So, you want to talk about Trump some more, or can we move on?
Can we move on?
You want any questions about Trump? Oh, huh?
Comey for a minute.
Comey.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the name. So we made some news yesterday, and well, I'll tell you about the interview. If you're talking about Lester Holt yesterday in particular, he was not the Trump that I had seen before in these settings. He was pissed off. You could see it walking in the door. He had a piece of paper in his hand that was a list of all the Democrats who had called for Comey's resignation. And
Is that what he's handing Lester?
yeah, and that's what he's handing Lester walking in the door. And he handed it to Lester. He likes Lester because Lester is impossible not to like as a human being and as a journalist. He's tough, but he is the soul of fairness and decorum and discretion. And he knows that about it. He's very comfortable with him. So anyway, but he flung the paper at him as if, you know, you're all alike, you guys. But anyway, here, my press guy, you know, and Kellyanne Conway's standing there, and some of the others whose name might not be familiar with you. But
Baghdad Bob, was he there?
no, he was not there. I think if I understand the reference that you're referring to. But he was sullen. He was visibly withdrawn. That was it sat down, lights come on. Lester asked a question about the emails and Hillary. He starts vamping. We turn it to Comey pretty quickly because it was going nowhere. It was a warm-up question. And he comes alive, and that's where he came out swinging. And he says very early in the interview, he's a showboat, and he's a show-off. And then very quickly got into what were the two areas that we came to see if we could find out about that just didn't make sense for everyone, which was one, you hadn't thought of firing him before you got these recommendations. You literally asked for these recommendations, and that all just evolved in that moment. And he quickly dispelled that was, in fact, what happened. Nope, had made up my mind before. And then the other was he got right to Russia. You know, how could you have what were these three things that were in that letter that Comey had told you that led you to believe that you were not a target of the investigation? Mentions the dinner for the first time, mentions 2 phone calls, didn't get right according to Comey or Comey's.
People familiar with the situation.
People familiar, thank you so much.
Yeah.
You're such a good guy like there. We would have said some asshole next to Comey who said that. So the rest is now history.
Did the
We
weather
have a different narrative.
Did the weather in the room change when the president admitted that the official story for 36 hours was not in fact the case?
The aides were wide-eyed.
Really?
Wide-eyed.
Because they what was left of their credibility.
Yeah, was shattered. No, they were wide-eyed. But he was, you saw, he was completely comfortable. He was totally within his sphere of influence on this subject. He knew he was the only one who could tell it like it was in his mind. I found the moment where he was reflecting on how he talked to himself about it.
Yeah.
In some ways, the most fascinating.
I did like that he said, I said to myself, you know. You know, and I'm as crazy as anybody, but I don't think I've ever said, you know, to myself. You know.
He comes to play.
Well, this is the headline thing, if I can just say. This is, people always say he's about the deal. This goes straight back to Roy Cohn, you know, who was McCarthy's lawyer. And in fact, one of the fascinating things about this, and when the history of all this is written, which again may be fairly soon, is the three of the most important figures in the rise of Trump are Roy Cohn. So you don't have to make a McCarthy point. It is McCarthy. Roy Cohn was his lawyer. Rupert Murdoch, who helped create and sustain the tabloid culture that Trump rode to fame in New York, and for whom, you know, if you read the New York Post every morning, as so many of us did for so long, you know that the headline matters until about 8:30 a.m. And then it's all about the next headline. You know, again, there's no tabloids have no institutional memory by definition. It's whatever the dramatic story of that particular moment is. It's journalistic crack in many ways. And the other is Roger Ailes, the late chief of Fox News, who was Richard Nixon's ad man, worked for George H.W. Bush, started as a producer for the Mike Douglas show, but part of the media political establishment on the right was in many ways Rogers and Rupert's brainchild. And the way Richard Rovere of The New Yorker described McCarthy's skill was McCarthy was always about the afternoon paper's deadlines and the morning paper's deadlines. This is like talking about Thermopylae, I realize. But what McCarthy would do is he would call in the afternoon papers at noon. They all closed at 1 or so, and say, I'm seeking a witness in this particular case. So the headlines around the country were, McCarthy seeks bombshell witness. There was no witness. 6 hours would pass, morning papers locked up about 9:30. He'd call in the morning paper reporters and say, the witness is eluding me. Headlines all over America, witness eludes McCarthy in bombshell case. They must have something to hide. And it just rolled forward. And Trump either intellectually or intuitively understands that. Mm-hmm. And to me, one of the great questions, Charles and I were talking about this earlier with Curtis, by the way, when you die, God's face will look like Curtis. We hope it doesn't sound like that, but it could. We're going to put him in a reenactor's uniform and terrify everybody.
Or Colonel Sanders. I'm not
That's
sure
right.
which.
That's right. So intuitively or intellectually, he understands it. So today, when he would not deny the taping, what I want to know is, was he consciously thinking, I got to move the headline a little bit? And even though that's in many ways worse, he doesn't make those kind of value judgments. Because as you say, he always comes to play. And he knows our DNA. He knows that the press, by and large, are like second graders at a soccer game. We chase the ball. Nobody stays in position.
Now, into self-flagellation there, just back off a little bit. We're not juvenile. We're serious, mature, caring, compassionate, thoughtful.
Because second grade soccer is important.
So let me switch you to before we're leaving Trump. Because we got to cut. No? You want more?
He hasn't left us.
Ask a question. Yes, sir. Right there.
Do you believe that there's any tipping point where the Republican leaders are going to stand up to it?
Well, I think this, speaking just as an honest broker of information, what we're in store for is a great civics lesson. So I don't know the answer to that question, but I can't wait for it. I'm looking forward to it every hour of every day. And we're now in a place where, and I think this is really good for the country, and I certainly as a journalist, I feel lucky as hell to be looking at how to report this, which is, okay, what is involved with appointing a special prosecutor? What is involved if the director of the FBI is asked by the President of the United States for a loyalty test of some kind? Is that breaking the law? So we're into a level of discussion around what's happening here, what is really going on, that I think will beg the question you're asking about Republicans. There will be a level of accountability across the aisles in ways that we haven't seen the table stakes quite this way in quite a while.
I think there are some numbers to watch. First of all, if the Dow were at 17,000 right now, it'd be a whole different conversation. That's one. The upper middle class feels they're looking at their 401k statements. The number's been way up the past year or so. So at this point, it feels more like political paintball to a lot of people than it probably should. But to answer your question directly, and I've talked to some Republican senators about this, a lot of them are simply waiting for the train to really be at the edge of the cliff. And they don't know where that cliff is, but to torture this metaphor a little bit, it's going to start dinging like the way cars do now, where you're about to hit something and it starts to ding. When Trump's approval rating has a 2 in front of it, that's one.
Has any president ever had a 2 in front of it?
Truman and George W. Bush. Truman left at 21%.
Huh.
And now, and that's why all presidents want to be Truman, because they come back. And then W was down there for a while. Although W now looks like Cicero. So you wait long enough, anything can happen. If he were here, he'd go, that's right.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Bush family biographer.
Exactly, yeah. I spent a lot of time with these people. I'm like the world's least effective WASP psychotherapist. The other is when that when their poll numbers start coming down and when they're the generic Republican-Democratic ballot in House and Senate races. It's the generic, it's not the particular. They freak out when they see, their pollsters always ask, in their district, in their state, would you vote for a Republican or a Democrat? And that's a number that's often different than when you put the incumbent in, because people have a bias toward the incumbent usually. But they start to flip out, that's a technical historical term, when the generic number puts them in a deficit situation.
Yeah. What was Nixon when Barry Goldwater went to?
He was right about 30.
Questions? Any more questions?
August 6th.
Right now? Yes, sir. Or ma'am, I beg your pardon.
It's dark. Y'all need to give more money because apparently there's some light issues.
During the election out here in the country, not in the bubble, okay?
Yep.
You can see that.
Just for the record, Mississippi's not the country, but go ahead.
You can see at 10 o'clock, between 10 and 11 every day, it was just so obvious. Trump would say something insane, just madly insane. And then that would open the 5:30 news every night. It was just like day after day after day after day. Now my little addiction is that MSNBC group from 6 o'clock to midnight or whatever. They're doing the same thing.
Oh, Jesus.
Their shamelessly is out.
How could they do that?
They're winning the demo, ma'am.
So when will you understand that he's messing with you?
It's a great question. It's a great question. That's a great question.
If he does something outrageous, then tomorrow he's going to just say something even more outrageous. And that opens the news every night. I mean, I'd rather watch the petunias grow in Nebraska than
Well,
Do they broadcast that?
60 minutes on that.
That's a great, and Andy should answer it, but that's a great question. It's a fundamental question about, here in a Center for Journalism, about what is news. If the President of the United States says something beyond what we think of as the pale, which is changing all the time, to what extent does a journalist have a civic responsibility not to report it? That's a very hard thing. This may just be something, democracy doesn't.
27 times. I can understand 3, 5, 10 times. But 300 times.
I don't know. I disagree respectfully because the job of the Fourth Estate is to report it so that when you finish watching the petunias, you then do something about it. Right? That's the Third Estate, the people.
there is a little nuance to this, which is this is a plug for Ole NBC, but more Americans watch NBC News than any other news organization in the world. They watch that primarily on what we would call the broadcast platform. And on that platform, the tens of millions of people who watch the Today Show, for example, or nightly news, are not obsessed with what Trump has said all day long or all the previous night. And in fact, they vote through their Nielsen boxes, and Trump is not the news for them every night, and they don't want it. And if we overdo it, we can see them saying, let me know when he does something that rises to what I would describe, to your comment, is really the news of the night that I want to know. So, and the same is true of the Today Show. MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News are political news channels for a much, much smaller audience of people who are fascinated with the political details of the day. Who said what to whom? What does it all mean? Tell me at 6 o'clock, tell me at 7 o'clock, tell me what new you know at 8 o'clock. And the reality is now, because of the news cycle, we do have little new nuggets at 6, 7, 8, 10. Not for most normal people who have other things to do with their life, but those who are into the political nugget business or nutcase business, we serve to please. And the reality is that is a lot of process, and it is fascinating to political journalists and to an audience right now that is as large as we've ever seen. We're breaking we've been, MSNBC's 20 years old. I think CNN is actually 30, but we're having the largest audiences, CNN and MSNBC, but MSNBC in particular has the largest audience that cable news for a regularly scheduled program has ever seen. So that is a Trump effect, no question. I just want to ask one question because you know the president's pretty good, and you're so familiar with the characteristics, the significant and important characteristics of presidents. What's the takeaway for people when you think of presidential character? What are the patterns in the presidents you've studied and written about?
Well, first is character is destiny. It does matter. The appetites, ambitions, vices and virtues, predilections and foilables of the individual person. It hasn't always, but it particularly in the nuclear era, it does. Do y'all know this? The President of the United States is given like a hotel key card every morning with the nuclear codes that goes into that case that's carried around called the football. And there's no check on that. It's designed for the Cold War doctrine of massive retaliation. So presumably we would only have 15, 20 minutes to respond to an intercontinental attack. So every morning, the President of the United States is handed the means to destroy the world. And it's not a decision that goes to the Joint Chiefs. It doesn't go to the Strategic Air Command. It just happens. Now, there's an inter-theater thing. If there's a Korean problem, if there's something in the Gulf, and it's possibly a tactical strike, that has all sorts of checks and balances. But when we vote for this person, they still have that power every day. The codes change, and they bring the card every morning. So it matters. And my own view, I've written about 5 or 6 of them. I've been lucky enough in my professional life I've spent time with every president of my lifetime except for President Reagan, who got sick sort of when I came along. I did get to know Mrs. Reagan, who I pointed out to her once. It was actually Andy knows this, it was very disturbing to go have lunch with Mrs. Reagan because she always knew more gossip about what was going on in Washington than I did. So I used to have to call people and report.
Hollywood.
Oh God. And she would push this half a Cobb salad around and wouldn't eat. And be slightly disappointed that I knew so little. But I said to her, maybe we all be loved as Nancy Davis loved Ronald Reagan. I said to her once, ma'am, it's remarkable how President Reagan improved on Jesus. She said, what do you mean? I said, well, now there are a lot of even ministers who think that Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount that we shall be as a shining city on a hill. It was as a city on a hill, right? Reagan inserted that visual addition, and it's a better image. And she said, well, yes, I think Ronnie would have improved on Jesus. So, believe me, my Mississippi-born wife does not say that about me in any possible way. So I think that my own view is they need to be humble in the sense that, not in the Franciscan sense, though that might help, but they need to be able to learn from their mistakes. And that's I don't know about you all, it's the hardest thing in the world for me. If you magnify that by the level of someone who's come through a life, either in business or politics or the military, come through a campaign, and is in the Oval Office, where everyone standing outside the Oval Office says, I'm gonna go in there and tell him what's what, and then they get in and they say, oh, what a lovely time, Mr. President. This just happens endlessly. So they'd have to be able to acknowledge mistakes, and that's incredibly difficult. But we wouldn't be here if John Kennedy hadn't been able to do that. His learning curve from the Bay of Pigs in April of '61 to the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62 was enormous. He totally blew the Bay of Pigs. He then reached out, he had the courage to reach out to the last person on the planet he wanted to appear weak in front of, and that was Dwight Eisenhower. Kennedy had called Eisenhower that old asshole during the campaign. Eisenhower had called Kennedy that young whippersnapper. Kennedy had come in, they'd wanted to shake up what they thought of as the ossified Eisenhower style of decision making. So they all wanted to be Ian Fleming. Bobby Kennedy and Jack Kennedy wanted to decide things quickly. They decided the invasion quickly. It was a disaster. He asked Eisenhower for advice. Ike said, well, when you're faced with an immense decision, you have to have everyone in the room who has a stake in the decision and hear everything out together so you can weigh it as one. Good example for any leader. October 1962, when Kennedy gets photographic evidence that the Soviet Union is deploying offensive nuclear weapons into Cuba, 90 miles away, the casualty estimates that there had been an exchange of weapons in the hemisphere in 62 were 70 to 100 million Americans. It's hard to imagine if there had been an exchange that the ordinary structure of life as we know it today would have survived. And that's not just because, as you all may remember, when Bobby Kennedy first heard about it, he said, well, can Khrushchev aim them at Oxford, Mississippi? So if you think
Come on, you gotta love that one.
if you think that partisanship, if you think things haven't been bad before, they were pretty bad. Your Attorney General wanted to end it. And so what did he do? He convened the longest committee meeting in American history, 13 days, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, and we got through it. I think that they have to be candid in the sense, not just telling you the truth all the time, because nobody does that, but about the stakes of large national and international enterprises. Presidents who get in trouble are the ones who don't level with us about what something's going to cost and what it's going to take. Johnson in Vietnam being the great example. Churchill was the best at this, and Roosevelt learned it from Churchill. January of 42, Churchill was facing a vote of confidence in the House of Commons. And at that point, Pearl Harbor had happened, Singapore had fallen, Hitler was on the move, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa. It was just a disastrous moment for the Allies. And Churchill got up and he said, the British people can face any misfortune with fortitude and buoyancy as long as they are convinced that those who are in charge of their affairs are not deceiving them or are not themselves dwelling in a fool's paradise. So basically, don't lie to us and don't be kidding yourself. Give it to us straight and we'll do what it takes. And that's the covenant of modern democracies.
So pulling this full circle, how explosive or how bad on the Richter scale of America? Is there some Chinese food being delivered? How on the Richter scale of America,
Yeah.
how is the Trump presidency going so far?
Well, it's pretty high on the Richter scale. He is the most unconventional president we've ever had. The Jackson analogy is not particularly sound. By the time Andrew Jackson became president, he had been a prosecutor, a judge, a senator, had run for president and won the popular vote, and was then president. Jackson was able to use his vices as virtues. He knew that people thought he was crazy, so he leveraged that. I'm not entirely sure this president knows the depth of that feeling. I'm really not. I'm not being clever. I think it's the hardest thing in the world. I think self-knowledge is the hardest thing in the world. It's why we have philosophy. And I don't think he's particularly strong on that. Jackson was a crazy man, let's be clear. He once said that his only regrets in public life were that he had not hung Henry Clay and shot John C. Calhoun. Now, Calhoun was his vice president. Nobody felt that way about their running mate until John McCain. So no, we're in large. This is bad for my business, but we're in largely uncharted waters here.
So let's just. I can't resist because we're at this glorious place called the Overby Center for Southern Politics and Journalism. If we can turn in a remaining moment or two that we've got to Southern politics, Tennessee, Mississippi, how's the Democratic Party doing in the South?
Thank you all for coming. And I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I went to Sewanee, which, those of you who don't know it well, it's a combination of Downton Abbey and Deliverance. You'll hear that again. I live in Nashville. When I was growing up, we have 9 congressmen. It was 7 Democrats, 2 Republicans. There was kind of a blue or red wall at Chattanooga. East Tennessee, which was very unionist, was Republican, but moving across the state, it was all Democratic. Al Gore was our senator. Jim Sasser was our senator. We had Democratic governors. And now it is 63% Trump state. I know that sounds low to y'all. And 7 Republicans in the House and 2 Democrats. And the 2 Democrats are from the 2 big cities. Trump carried 93 out of 95 counties in the state. And I have a lot of Democratic friends. In fact, I know all of them. Sometimes we meet in a booth because we can fit at Denny's. And we don't go to Cracker Barrel. It's a state of deep clinical political depression. There are spikes of people think, oh, I'm sure today there are Democrats in the South who are thinking, okay, surely this will do it. But it's like Trump is like Lucy and the football, and there's very little infrastructure anymore. It's interesting, my friend Lamar Alexander, who was governor in the 70s and 80s and has been senator since 2000, actually in some ways is a victim of his own success, my view, not his. But the Southern governors who did really well at recruiting, particularly Japanese and German businesses, sometimes you wonder who really won the war. In Tennessee, VW and Nissan are 2 huge employers, and I'm sure that's true here at some level. And the prosperity that those industries have created have brought in a lot of people who are what some people in Tennessee anyway refer to as Fox News Republicans. They're people who are national Republicans who don't really get involved in the local scene, so they just vote R and against the D. And so one of the interesting things as going forward is, as the South, God willing, prospers, in North Carolina, in South Carolina, in Tennessee, in Mississippi, Georgia's a little bit of an outlier because of Atlanta, although watch out for Governor Yates, who might be coming. You have people coming in who, will they make these states a bit more moderate, or if they make the decision to move, are they already culturally inclined to a more red state habit of heart and mind?
And this all goes back to the Southern strategy born in Greenville with Clark Reed.
With Clark.
Yeah. What did Johnson say?
Johnson said in '64, he turned to Bill Moyers after he signed the Civil Rights Act and said, I just handed the South to the Republicans for a generation. He was wrong, it's been 3.
Well, now you know why Jon Meacham is on the board of advisors for Mississippi Today.
I just want to say how, he doesn't know I'm going to do this, but how wonderful it is, Andy's work with this. Those of us who care about journalism, and now I think we all are learning more and more that we have to care about it all the time, have worried for a long time about how we were going to not find the talent to do the work, but find the economic infrastructure. And what the Texas Tribune has done in Texas and what Andy and you all are doing here is a model for all of us. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.